NBA players are renowned for their competitive nature and love of the game, but occasionally this passion may overflow into rage and hostility. Some of the most violent confrontations in NBA history have occurred when tempers flare on the court. Many incidents, which range from players punching each other to full-fledged brawls on the court, astonished the spectators. Here are some of the worst and most shocking brawls in NBA history that occurred when players became enraged. Number 7. Michael Jordan vs. Reggie Miller. In the 1990s, when Michael Jordan and the Bulls dominated the NBA, Jordan had a reputation as a fierce competitor. Reggie Miller of the Indiana Pacers was not far behind him in terms of competitive edge during that time. The Chicago Bulls were in the midst of their first ever three-peat as a franchise in 1993, and they were currently in their third season. In his sixth NBA season, Miller had already made a name for himself as an inflated and conceited leader. Late in a regular season match between the Pacers and Bulls, the two spirited competitors would face off. Michael Jordan was the trailing defender as the Pacers were on the fast break. Reggie Miller arrived to drain the rebound after Pooh Richardson missed a transition layup. Jordan was heading back up the court when Miller landed, so he met him under the basket and gave him a strong shove. This angered Jordan, who rushed Miller, and the two collided face-to-face on the court while yelling in each other's faces. Jordan punched the opponent, but nobody was seriously hurt when Bulls and Pacers staff intervened to separate them. Miller was not suspended, but was fined $6,000, while Jordan received a $10,000 fine and a one-game suspension. Number 6. Larry Bird vs. Julius Irving. One of the best small forwards to ever play the game of basketball is Larry Bird and Julius Irving. Each franchise had a representation in the NBA Finals during the 1980s and was frequently found at the top of the Eastern Conference standings. The Sixers started the season 5-0 in 1984 after winning the NBA title the previous year. A game of epic proportions was guaranteed when the Celtics started that same season 4-0. It had nothing to do with basketball and became just that. Bird had a stellar evening and scored 42 points in just 30 minutes. Irving was the exact opposite, scoring 6 points on just 3 of 13 shots. That evening, Bird made it clear to Irving that he was getting the better of him, and Irving did not like his antics. When they came face to face, they started grabbing each other by the throat. Following a few successful punches from Irving, chaos broke out as Celtics and Sixers players attempted to break up the fight. The two were quickly separated and removed from the game. Irving and Bird received a $7,500 fine, which at the time ranked as the second highest player sanction ever for an on-court altercation. Number 5. Phoenix Suns vs. New York Knicks. Both the New York Knicks and Phoenix Suns had ambitions of winning a championship in 1993. Both clubs had 6 wins. In a match between two elite teams in March, tensions were high from the first whistle. What happened next would go down in history as the most brutal fight of that season and one of the biggest of the 1990s. An unwarranted and unjustified cheap shot set it off just before halftime. As the first half came to a close, Doc Rivers was bringing up the ball for the Knicks. Suns player Kevin Johnson ran across the court and gave Rivers a forearm to the head and shoulder. Rivers sprinted after Johnson because, of course, he wanted a piece of Johnson. It was too late to stop the fighting as players and coaches flooded the court. Although the Knicks' Greg Anthony was forced to leave the game due to an ankle injury, he had little trouble racing across the court and launching a jumper that led to a 12-player pileup. Rivers and Johnson each received a $15,000 fine in addition to a 2-game suspension. Anthony was given the harshest penalty, which included a 5-game suspension and a $20,500 fine. Number 4. Kevin McHale vs. Kurt Rambis. One of the most famous rivalries in all of sports has been between the Los Angeles Lakers and Boston Celtics since the 1960s. 3 of the 4 championships won between 1980 and 1983 were attributed to the Celtics and Lakers. Then, for the first time in the NBA Finals in 1984, the two groups faced off against the Magic-Bird rivalry. Up until Game 4, the series had been tense and a back-and-forth brawl. The series outcome was altered by what happened following, which helped the Celtics win the NBA title. With a few minutes remaining in Game 4, the Celtics were down 76-70 as Kurt Rambis of the Lakers was on his way to a layup on a fast break. Rambis was knocked to the ground by the Celtics' Kevin McHale, who sprinted across the court. Rambis charged, prepared to engage in combat, but teammate James Worthy once more slammed Rambis to the ground to end the altercation. This gave the Celtics some new motivation, and they went on to win 3 of their final 4 games to claim the NBA championship. Rambis and McHale received no repercussions for what happened. Number 3. Denver Nuggets vs. New York Knicks Brawl. In the 2000s, there were two teams with different goals, the Denver Nuggets and the New York Knicks. The Nuggets, who boasted NBA superstar Carmelo Anthony, consistently competed far into the NBA playoffs. The Knicks had one of the worst basketball teams and were in the midst of a rebuild. For a typical December battle with the Knicks, the Nuggets arrived at Madison Square Garden and immediately started to dominate them on the court. With only a few seconds left in the game, Denver coach George Karl made the decision to keep his starters in despite being 20 points ahead. The Knicks were incensed by this and responded accordingly. When Knicks reserve Marty Collins fouled Nuggets guard J.R. Smith hard, sending him tumbling to the court, Smith was on a fast break for a layup. Nate Robinson started taking full-on swings at Smith as players from both sides rushed to the action. When he entered the fray, Carmelo Anthony, who was playing for the Nuggets at the time, smacked Collins in the face before fleeing the scene as quickly as he had arrived. Referees were unable to control the melee as it continued to worsen. Robinson and J.R. Smith were suspended for 10 games, and each team was fined $500,000 for the altercation. Jared Jeffries of the Knicks received a 4-game suspension, while Collins received a 6-game suspension. Carmelo Anthony got the harshest penalty with 15 games for his cunning, cheap shot. Number 2. Rudy Tomjanovich vs. Kermit Washington. Believe it or not, the sports industry was irrevocably altered by one blow. The Houston Rockets and Los Angeles Lakers played one another on December 9, 1977, in a game that was otherwise unremarkable, but it took an ugly, violent turn in the first minute of the second half. While Houston's Kevin Cunnard and LA's Kermit Washington were trailing a Rockets fast break, they tangled. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, a teammate of Washington's, stepped in to break up the fight by grabbing Cunnard. Rockets captain Rudy Tomjanovich sped over after observing things from a distance. Washington paused, turned, and slammed a blow to Tomjanovich's square face after spotting him in his peripheral vision. The strike was almost fatal. Tomjanovich was taken urgently to the emergency room, where he was informed that he might not live. In addition to various facial injuries and spinal fluid leaks, the damage included a fractured skull, broken jaw, broken nose, and other facial injuries. Washington was penalized with a $10,000 fine and a 60-day no-pay suspension. Tomjanovich didn't suit up again that year, but he came back the following year to play in his 5th career All-Star game. Number 1. The Malice at the Palace. The 2004 altercation between the Pistons and Pacers, known as the Malice at the Palace, would be the most intense and biggest fights in NBA history. This early season game between these two teams was meant to serve as a sneak peek at the Eastern Conference Finals that year. The events that followed would dash the Pacers' ambitions, while they allowed the Pistons to regroup and go on to win the NBA title. Ben Wallace of the Pistons and Ron Artest of the Pacers got into a basic altercation before the huge riot broke out. Under the basket, Wallace and Artest collided chest to chest, engaging in heavy-handed pushing matches that forced both sides to separate the players. After everything calmed down, Artest made the decision to lay down on the scores table. Artest erupted as a fan suddenly tossed a full beer cup at him. Steven Jackson, Jermaine O'Neal, and other Pistons players joined Artest as he charged into the seats and began throwing haymakers at the person he believed had thrown the cup. O'Neal and others were continuing knocking out supporters left and right when things spilled back onto the court. The contest was called off, and the devastation and trash were all over the Auburn Hills floor. Artest received a season-long suspension. O'Neal received a 25-game ban, while Jackson received a 30-game ban. The Pistons' Ben Wallace was given a 6-game suspension, while others just earned a 1-game ban for abandoning their bench. Any dreams for a championship run in Indiana were dashed by the brawl, and the Pistons lost to the Spurs in the NBA Finals in 7 games. The altercation continues to be one of the most intense on-court clashes in NBA history.